exam that asks you what regions of the world have the most crime and also are the most economically unequal. It's not the United States, it's not Western Europe, it's in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's South America. And if we're looking at homicide, the relationship is basically the same, although the colors are pretty huge. You can zoom in, you can see the names of hunters. But this is why a little bit old because El Salvador has made kind of news recently because the president of El Salvador has basically mass arrested a bunch of people. So the crime rate is way down. It's very controversial as an approach to basically the rather extreme gangster that we want to do. But if you look at the labels of the countries, you can see that there are Latin American countries, Sub-Saharan Africa. So as well, there seems to be a positive relation between the Gini coefficient, the amount of inequality, and the amount of homicides. So it lends to this idea of political and economic structure affecting criminal decision making. But this is a little bit of a switch perhaps. We've tied it to crime rates, we've tied it to fear of crime rates, but we want to really know how this works. This is a really interesting question. How is it that the structure of the economy, the relationship between the individual and sort of what's going on at almost a macro level, how does that work its way into the decision making of your average run-of-the-mill individual trying to decide whether or not to commit a crime? It's a really important question that needs to be asked. We have a general understanding from radical phenomena about how this is supposed to work. We're breaking down social institutions and providing kind of criminal incentives and also a sense of resentment among the powerless. But how does this really operate at the individual level? In order to understand that, we have to understand the notion of crime as choice. Something we talked about in the context of determinants and inequity theory is the notion of crime as choice, potential-based and bad. So trying to make the connection between what's going on at like country level right now and what's going on at like the situation, what's going on for the individual, in like the criminal moment perhaps. How is the social and economic structure connected to criminal speech to make this thing in order to basically understand how something like the Gini coefficient is supposed to be cause of crime. In the context of deterrence, in the context of routine activities, we talked a bit about the notion of crime of choice. It's kind of built into those perspectives. We made the argument that the decision to commit crime is made for the exact same reasons and purposes and ends as all other forms of human behavior. All of the forms of human behavior are oriented toward the same end. And that end is to maximize utility, which is a very broad term. I don't know if you were discussing on this term. The term can be understood a couple of different ways, but the way that we're using it here is the maximization, the balance of benefit over cost, reward over punishment, pleasure over pain, and profit over loss. Utility is a balance of pleasure over pain, reward over punishment, benefit over cost, profit over loss. All human action, arguably, is oriented toward maximizing utility, maximizing benefit and cost. That can look at all different kinds of ways, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can define benefit, and a lot of different ways that we can minimize cost. Be a kind of economics, it's like maximizing literal dollar value. But all human action, the argument goes, and I think it's so general as to be true by definition. I don't know if you could find an example of human action that doesn't pursue utility. It's so true and it's so general that it's almost true by definition. It has to be true by definition. Human action is oriented toward benefit. We want to do things that are good for us in one way or another. So if all human action is oriented toward reward over punishment, pleasure over pain, profit over loss, benefit over loss, then crime needs to be understood in this context. Crime has to be understood also as a way in which to maximize utility, maximize benefit over profit, reward over punishment, pleasure over pain. And this is obvious in some types of crime, but all types of crime, certainly, category. Robbery, burglary, all property crime, all white collar crime, it obviously has the outcome, like the end of those actions is maximizing benefit. And financial benefit is the key outcome there. The acquisition of money and property and possessions. Well, that's most crime is property. Like even crime that isn't property crime, a lot of violent crime is related to property, one way or another. Like carjacking is an example of a violent crime that hits property. Robbery is another. There's so much property crime, including the amount of fraud that exists out there. The amount of fraud that's like occurring in the world that we don't know about. It is well known 99% of crime has at its end like actual physical property. But again, even noting a lot of violent crime that maybe is tied to the acquisition of stuff. You think about it as violent crime, but it's tied closely to the acquisition of stuff, material property wealth. So the violence that was shown up in this country and in other countries, in Central and South America in particular, those types of behaviors have again the key end of maximizing benefit in the as manifested in like material like acquisition of actual stuff. But there's all different other kinds of ways that you can maximize benefit through crime. It's not just the getting stuff. A lot of violence is at its end, the getting of stuff. But you can get other things from crime as well. Things we talked about. Not just money, but things along the lines of power, status, identity, reputation. All of those things combined, so social reinforcement. All of those types of things are ends, they're benefits, they're things that we want. And crime can be a way of getting those things. It's a really good book. You need to get another book recommendation called Monster. The book's called Monster. It's written an autobiography of an LA gang member who's basically a hitman for the gangs from prison. And he killed a lot of people. One of the reasons he killed a lot of people. Found enjoyed it. Yeah, he found enjoyed it. Power and status, identity, reputation, killing people. And it was very much focused on the utility of those activities. The end of utility was very much clearly the killing of people. So all human action is oriented toward maximizing benefit and minimizing cost, maximizing reward and minimizing punishment, maximizing pleasure perhaps and minimizing. If all human action is human crime is succeeded with that end, how do we get to the end? How do we achieve the end of utility? One way that all this is one way that human beings can achieve the end of utility, maximizing the end of cost, is by means of rationality. By means of rationality. How do people make choices that best maximize utility? That best make sure that we're maximizing benefit, minimizing cost. Maximizing reward, minimizing. The most efficient way of achieving the end of utility is rationality. Rationality, as we're using it in this class, if you're into philosophy, this might be a little bit confusing, but we're using it very specifically. Rationality, as we're using it here, is a consideration of evidence. Rationality is a consideration of evidence. What is that evidence about? That evidence is about the course of action and whether pursuing that course of action will indeed help us achieve the end of utility. If we have evidence that doing a thing will help us get the thing we want, that's evidence. That's evidence. That's evidence that makes that choice, that decision, more rational. So utility, maximizing benefit, minimizing cost. So if the goal is to maximize benefit, minimize cost, we can use evidence and use rationality to help us get to the end that is. So you can use evidence that a particular course of action will help us achieve the end of utility. It's sometimes described as the norm of efficiency rationality. It is the way in which we can most efficiently achieve the end. There's a lot of ways to get what we want, but evidence will line up evidence. One way to help us get there, the speed way perhaps, to get us there most efficiently. All different kinds of examples that we can talk about. But here's one example. You have evidence, maybe from your studies, that there are certain courses of action that help you achieve the end of a good grade. You have evidence. You've been students for almost at least maybe longer than that. And you have evidence based on your own personal experience, perhaps to other extent, the experience of others that people are communicating. That's a kind of evidence. Obviously, it's less good than the very proximate evidence. You know, perhaps, that maybe spending all night learning and taking the exam the next day is evidence that maybe I'm not able to grade. Maybe you figure that out. If not, FYI. That's the way, that's a piece of evidence that maybe you learned. Maybe there are certain types of studying strategies that you've given. And you find that, oh man, my exam grade was better. That's a piece of evidence. That's a rational decision on your part to use evidence to help you achieve the end that is a higher grade. Evidence can mean a lot of different kinds of things. It's often tied to personal experience, but it's not. When the Winter Olympics were happening a few years ago, I read this article about how Olympic skiers choose their equipment. And it's a very almost scientific process how Olympic skiers choose the equipment. I don't know anything about skiing, but it's like how like the compounds, the different brands, like all of the stuff that they use to make sure their equipment is functioning and can be as good as possible. And the good as possible means the end of utility. It's like the best style but look, there's reliance very much so on fitness. That doing that thing, altering your equipment, using specific equipment, is going to get you the fastest time, it's going to get you the end that is utility. That's a more rational decision. If the end is true, then science is reliance on evidence to get us to the end of truth. Sometimes people describe science as in the scientific method, as the apotheosis of rationality, the highest point of rationality. It is humans trying to be as careful as possible when it's done properly. The assessment of evidence, be as careful and clear and trying to think of all different possible alternatives. That's what science is all about. It's using man's rational reliance on evidence to achieve the end that is going to be true, depending on or in the case of science. But then, what's important to note also is rationality is not just a thing you use or a thing you don't. It can also be a matter of degree. Rationality can be a matter of degree. The choices that people make can be more or less rational. So here's an example of that. So I have two little kids, obviously they're 7 and 3. And we have not gotten the stomach flu in my house in a couple of years. Okay.